Night came without warning. Not like in books, soft, beautiful, with stars. Night in the Greek village by the sea was black as a closed wound. It swallowed the outlines of houses, erased the road, drowned out voices, and left only one thing that could not be drowned out, the sound of the waves. Not melodious, not romantic. Deafening. Heavy. As if the sea was chewing something and couldn't swallow it. Where during the day it smelled of fish and salt, at night it smelled of fear. It had no smell of its own, but it lived in every little thing, in doors that closed earlier than usual, in lanterns that were extinguished to save oil, as if darkness could be deeper than poverty, in voices that grew quieter when the conversation turned to those who had gone out to sea and never returned. She sat on the threshold and listened. Her name was Philomela, a name that once meant song, but now was only a sign of a person who had forgotten what peace sounded like. She did not cry. In the Greek world, crying only made sense after death had become a fact. And until that fact existed, there was the cruelest form of hope, waiting. Her husband had gone out to sea before dawn. He said he would be back by sunset because the wind was right and the waves were not too high. He said it the way people say things when they want to convince themselves first. He was not a hero. He was not a warrior. He was just someone who knew that if there was no catch today, there would be less food in the house tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, less strength to pretend that everything was normal. Philomela remembered how he tied the rope on the boat. He pulled it tight 3 times, then stopped, as if he had suddenly remembered something important, and touched the wooden side with his fingers. It wasn't a caress. It was the touch of a man asking the tree not to break. She thought then, he is afraid. And then she immediately corrected herself, they are all afraid. Because the sea did not need a reason to kill. It did not punish or show mercy. It simply did what it wanted. That was its holiness, not good, not light, but boundless and indifferent. The day passed as usual, someone repaired nets, someone cleaned fish, someone yelled at children for making too much noise, as if noise could bring trouble. Life here was based on habit. And on lies, quiet, almost innocent ones. Everything will be fine. He will return. The wind is right. When the sun touched the horizon and began to slowly disappear, Philomela moved closer to the water. Others were already standing on the shore. Not because they knew anything. But because people always gather together when they can't do anything. At first, only the dark horizon was visible. Then one of the men squinted and said he could see a sail. Someone else chimed in. Someone even smiled, briefly, as if afraid to jinx their luck. Philomela felt something rise in her chest, not joy, but that misplaced hope that always comes before the blow. They waited. And then the wave brought not a boat. It brought a board. At first, no one understood what it was. The board could have been made of anything, the sea always throws up debris, but sometimes it does so as if it wants to say something. The board was picked up on the sand, turned over, and the moonlight fell on the wet wood so that scratches and fresh breaks became visible. Someone came closer and froze. Because there was a small mark carved on this board, a sign that was put on a boat to recognize it from afar. Their mark. No one screamed. No one cried out. No one fell to their knees. In the Greek world, people knew that the most frightening thing was the silence that came when it became clear that there would be no explanation. Philomela did not go to the board. She stood as if her feet were rooted to the ground. She looked at the sea as one looks at a living creature that is impossible to hate, because hatred requires meaning. And here there was no meaning. Someone nearby whispered. It's Poseidon. Someone else replied. No. It's us. We did something. This second phrase was more frightening than the first. Because if it was Poseidon, then it was a force that could be negotiated with. But if it was, we did something, then it meant that the god wasn't just powerful. He was attentive. He remembered. He punished precisely. Philomela felt another question rising inside her, not, where is he, or even, is he alive? But a question that destroys a person faster than death. Why? Translated with Deep L. Calm, free version. She was not an atheist. On the contrary, she did everything right. She placed a small bowl of wine near the hearth. She did not say unnecessary words when passing by the sanctuary. She knew that one should not boast about happiness. Happiness is a challenge to the gods. She knew that one should not show pride. Pride was an invitation to punishment. She lived as if the whole world were made of thin glass. And yet the glass cracked. She did not sleep that night. The village did not sleep either, but in different ways. Some sat in their homes and remained silent. Others searched for the cause with their eyes. Others whispered the names of gods as if the right name could stop death. Closer to midnight, an old priest, not majestic, not important, just an old man with a voice that had known much weeping, came out to a small stone altar near the shore. People gathered around him not because they believed in him more than in the sea, but because he was the only one who had the right to speak to what did not respond. The priest was silent for a long time. Then he slowly said, "The wind has changed." It sounded strangely mundane, and that's why it was scary. Because the cruelest things in life are always mundane. "The wind has changed," he repeated. "And we did not give what we had to give." Someone in the crowd gasped. "What?" they whispered. The priest looked at the sea. Not with prayer. Not with love. With the caution of a man who knows that if he says the wrong thing now, it will be worse. "Poseidon does not need our words," he said. "He needs us to remember the boundaries." Boundaries. That word was the key to everything. In the Greek world, there was no such thing as sin, as a stain on the soul. There was only a boundary that could not be crossed. You can be poor. You can be cruel. You can be evil. But you cannot behave as if you are allowed more than others. You cannot think that the gods do not care. You couldn't forget that the world had its price. And when something broke, people didn't ask if it was an accident. Accident is too empty. Accident doesn't allow you to act. People asked, "What is the price?" The priest ordered a small white goat to be brought. Not a big one. Not a solemn one. A small, domestic one, one of those that are a pity because they have not yet had time to become something useful. Philomela saw the animal being led away and felt a lump in her throat. Not because of the blood. Because of the thought that life could be given not for the sake of good, but so that the world would stop beating. When the goat was placed near the altar, there was a moment of silence, as if even the sea was listening. The priest raised his knife. And then Philomela suddenly understood, this was not about the gods. It was about people. It was about the fact that they couldn't bear the thought that a man could disappear just like that. That life could end without meaning. That there was no reckoning in the world. The sacrifice was a way of saying, "No. There is meaning. We just don't know it yet." The knife fell. Blood touched the stone. And at that moment, people did not feel relief, no. They felt something rarer than happiness. The feeling that they had done something. Because when you can do nothing, you die even while alive. And when you do something, even something small, you regain the right to breathe. Philomela did not look at the blood. She looked at the sea. She waited for a sign. She waited for the waves to soften. For the wind to change. For the world to pretend, at least for a second, that it had heard her. And the world, as always, promised nothing. But a new thought was already forming in Philomela's mind. A thought that would eventually become the basis of everything. If the gods can be paid, then they can be negotiated with. And if they can be negotiated with, then fear has a form. And if fear has a form, it can be repeated. This is not how faith begins. This is how ritual begins. This is how the path from chaos to order begins. And in one small settlement by the sea, where people stood around a stone, something happened that would later be repeated thousands of times throughout Greece. Fear ceased to be just a feeling. It became a rule. Philomela returned home as if she were being carried by habit rather than her own feet. She entered the dark room, where the smell of the day's fire still lingered, ash, grease, and a little fish that had not been eaten. Her husband's folded cloak lay in the corner. He always threw it there carelessly, as if he were sure he would take it again tomorrow. Now the cloak looked like someone else's skin. She sat down by the fire and stared at the ashes for a long time. There was something humiliating about the ashes, they remained even when the person disappeared. There was no tragedy in them. Only the fact that there had once been warmth. At night, she heard her neighbors whispering behind the wall. Their words were short and cautious, as if they could be overheard by more than just humans. They talked about the wind, about signs, about sacrifice, and still came back to the same question, why? The Greek world could not tolerate emptiness. If something happened, there had to be a reason. Otherwise, one would have to admit that life was just a coincidence, and that was worse than any god. She fell asleep only at dawn and dreamed of a shore, but without the sea. It was as if someone had cut off the waves, leaving only wet sand and the bones of ships. She woke up to the sound of a rooster crowing somewhere in the distance. The sound was almost offensive, the world was still going on. When she went outside, the light was cold. The same silence hung over the village as after a funeral, when everyone is tired of crying and starts thinking about bread. Near the altar, someone was already cleaning up the traces of the night. The stone was being washed with sea water, as if they wanted to erase even the memory of blood. But memory cannot be erased with water. It can only be erased by new events. Philomela saw an old woman on the threshold, Euterpe, whom everyone in the village feared and needed. She was not a priestess. She did not wear wreaths. She did not speak solemnly. But she knew what was not written on stone, how to hold a child with a fever, how to whisper words over water, how to look at the sky as if it too could be an enemy. Euterpe beckoned her with a gesture. You must not remain alone, she said quietly. Loneliness is noise. It can be heard. Philomela wanted to argue, but she couldn't. In this world, even feelings could be dangerous if they weren't formalized into a rule. And rules always gave a sense of protection. Come with me, said Euterpe. To the sanctuary on the hill. Today. Philomela knew this place. Every village had something like it, a stone platform with a small altar and several statues, already half worn away by time. People went there not only to ask for something. More often, it was to make sure that the world was still holding together. The two of them set off, and the road led between olive trees. The trees stood silently, like those who had seen many deaths and no longer reacted. The Greeks liked to think that the gods lived in groves and springs, but in reality they loved something else, the feeling that nature was listening. Philomela felt the air change. In a city or even a village, there is always human noise, even if it is quiet. Here there was no noise. Only the wind. There were already people on the hill. Not many, but enough to share the fear. They did not speak loudly. They brought small things, a piece of bread, a jug of wine, a bunch of herbs. It didn't look like a big ceremony. It looked like a habit. But habit is what makes religion stronger than any king. The priest, the same old man, stood by the stone. His face was wrinkled like dry earth. He looked at Philomela as if he already knew everything she was feeling. That was his power, not in words, but in the fact that he always seemed to be one step closer to the reasons. You have lost, he said. Philomela did not answer. You think it's punishment, the priest continued. But punishment is also mercy. Punishment means that you have been noticed. Someone in the crowd sighed quietly. The phrase was almost cruel, but it gave people what they wanted, meaning. Even if that meaning was terrifying. The priest raised his hands, and everyone fell even more silent. There are things we do for the gods, he said. And there are things we do for ourselves. Today we will do both. He took a jug of wine and slowly poured it onto the stone. The wine flowed, mixed with dust, and became a dark stain that resembled blood. Symbols in this world always worked. Symbols were a bridge between what a person could see and what they feared. Philomela watched and suddenly realized that her fear was beginning to change. It was no longer sharp. It was becoming heavy. It was as if a stone had been placed inside her chest. It was not relief. It was adaptation. She wanted to ask about her husband. She wanted to beg for at least a phrase, "He will return," or "He is with the gods." But the priest did not talk about specific people. He talked about order. About boundaries. About what cannot be violated. It was scary because it meant that man is not the center of history. The center is balance. After the ritual, Euterpe did not take her home. She took her to another place, below the hill, where there was a small stone passage between the trees. There were no statues there. There was no altar. There was only a narrow spring. Water came out of the stone as if the stone were crying. "Here, people don't pray loudly," said Euterpe. "Here, they listen." Philomela bent down and touched the water. The water was cold and clear, but there was something disturbing about it. It was as if it were underground, as if it belonged not to people but to the earth. It seemed to her that the water knew more than she did. "You think the gods want blood," said Euterpe. "In fact, the gods want us to remember who we are." "Who are we?" Philomela asked quietly. Euterpe smiled, but it was not a warm smile. "We are those who fear. And those who are not afraid quickly become food for the world." Philomela wanted to argue. She wanted to say that fear was humiliation. But she didn't have the strength. Because this world did not give people the right to proud words. It only gave them the right to survive. When they returned to the village, the men were already standing by the shoreline. They looked at the sea as if they were looking at the gates of a prison. As if how long you look at them determines whether they will be opened. One of the men approached Euterpe. "The priest says we must go to Delphi," he whispered. "We must ask." Philomela felt a chill inside her. She knew about Delphi. Everyone knew. Even those who had never seen the mountain on which the temple stood. Delphi was not just a place. It was an idea, that someone could know the future. "They don't give answers," said Euterpe. "They give words that you then live with." It was said as if that were worse. Philomela stood and listened, and suddenly understood what had happened to her in one night. Her personal pain had become part of something bigger. She was no longer a widow or a future widow. She had become proof that the world could strike anyone. And when that happens, society does what it has always done. It looks for a place where fear can be turned into knowledge. That is why people went to the oracles. Not because they were stupid. But because life without answers is unbearable. A few days later, a small group of men set off. A young man, the son of one of the fishermen who had seen the sea take his uncle, went with them. He wanted to hear from the gods what no one in the village could tell him. He wanted to hear why. Philomela did not go. She stayed behind. But she knew that if they returned, the village would never be the same again. Because either they would bring words that would calm them, or words that would shatter the last remnants of peace. Delphi always worked the same way. They did not give simple answers. They gave ambiguity. But ambiguity is not deception. It is a tool. It allowed a person to choose for themselves what truth to bear. Philomela sat by the house and waited. Now she was not waiting for her husband. She was waiting for meaning. And at some point, she realized that this waiting was changing her more than any death. Because waiting for meaning means already acknowledging that it exists. And if it exists, then it can be obtained. And if it can be obtained, then it requires those who know how. This is how another thing is born that will be stronger than fear. A mediator. One who speaks with the gods. One who understands the signs. One who knows the right words, the right time, the right sacrifice. And when a mediator appears, religion ceases to be just a response to chaos. It becomes a structure. And structure is always the beginning of power. You think it's punishment, the priest continued. But punishment is also mercy. Punishment means that you have been noticed. Someone in the crowd sighed quietly. The phrase was almost cruel, but it gave people what they wanted, meaning. Even if that meaning was terrifying. The priest raised his hands, and everyone fell even more silent. There are things we do for the gods, he said. And there are things we do for ourselves. Today we will do both. He took a jug of wine and slowly poured it onto the stone. The wine flowed, mixed with dust, and became a dark stain that resembled blood. Symbols in this world always worked. Symbols were a bridge between what a person could see and what they feared. Philomela watched and suddenly realized that her fear was beginning to change. It was no longer sharp. It was becoming heavy. It was as if a stone had been placed inside her chest. It was not relief. It was adaptation. She wanted to ask about her husband. She wanted to beg for at least a phrase, "He will return," or "He is with the gods." But the priest did not talk about specific people. He talked about order. About boundaries. About what cannot be violated. It was scary because it meant that man is not the center of history. The center is balance. After the ritual, Euterpe did not take her home. She took her to another place, below the hill, where there was a small stone passage between the trees. There were no statues there. There was no altar. There was only a narrow spring. Water came out of the stone as if the stone were crying. "Here, people don't pray loudly," said Euterpe. "Here, they listen." Philomela bent down and touched the water. The water was cold and clear, but there was something disturbing about it. It was as if it were underground, as if it belonged not to people but to the earth. It seemed to her that the water knew more than she did. "You think the gods want blood," said Euterpe. "In fact, the gods want us to remember who we are." "Who are we?" Philomela asked quietly. Euterpe smiled, but it was not a warm smile. "We are those who fear. And those who are not afraid quickly become food for the world." Philomela wanted to argue. She wanted to say that fear was humiliation. But she didn't have the strength. Because this world did not give people the right to proud words. It only gave them the right to survive. When they returned to the village, the men were already standing by the shoreline. They looked at the sea as if they were looking at the gates of a prison. As if how long you look at them determines whether they will be opened. One of the men approached Euterpe. "The priest says we must go to Delphi," he whispered. "We must ask." Philomela felt a chill inside her. She knew about Delphi. Everyone knew. Even those who had never seen the mountain on which the temple stood. Delphi was not just a place. It was an idea, that someone could know the future. "They don't give answers," said Euterpe. "They give words that you then live with." It was said as if that were worse. Philomela stood and listened, and suddenly understood what had happened to her in one night. Her personal pain had become part of something bigger. She was no longer a widow or a future widow. She had become proof that the world could strike anyone. And when that happens, society does what it has always done. It looks for a place where fear can be turned into knowledge. That is why people went to the oracles. Not because they were stupid. But because life without answers is unbearable. A few days later, a small group of men set off. A young man, the son of one of the fishermen who had seen the sea take his uncle, went with them. He wanted to hear from the gods what no one in the village could tell him. He wanted to hear why. Philomela did not go. She stayed behind. But she knew that if they returned, the village would never be the same again. Because either they would bring words that would calm them, or words that would shatter the last remnants of peace. Delphi always worked the same way. They did not give simple answers. They gave ambiguity. But ambiguity is not deception. It is a tool. It allowed a person to choose for themselves what truth to bear. Philomela sat by the house and waited. Now she was not waiting for her husband. She was waiting for meaning. And at some point, she realized that this waiting was changing her more than any death. Because waiting for meaning means already acknowledging that it exists. And if it exists, then it can be obtained. And if it can be obtained, then it requires those who know how. This is how another thing is born that will be stronger than fear. A mediator. One who speaks with the gods. One who understands the signs. One who knows the right words, the right time, the right sacrifice. And when a mediator appears, religion ceases to be just a response to chaos. It becomes a structure. And structure is always the beginning of power. There came days when it was impossible to laugh. Days when it was impossible to go out to sea. Days when everyone had to be present, even if they didn't believe. Because faith didn't matter here. What mattered was compliance. Philomela participated in everything. Not because she wanted to. But because she now knew that indifference was a new form of pride. She learned to remain silent at the right moments. To bow her head not out of obedience, but out of caution. She felt her personal pain dissolve into the general order. It was unfair. But it made it possible to live. This is how religion ceases to be a response to tragedy. It becomes a safeguard. And when that happens, something else emerges, dangerous and inevitable. Those who know the rules better than others. Those who remember the calendar. Those who decide whether fear was sufficient. And very soon, these people begin to speak not only about when and how, but also why. It is from this moment that religion ceases to belong to everyone. It begins to belong to those who control fear. After returning from Delphi, a new sound appeared in the village. Not loud. Not sharp. The sound of counting down. People began to count the days. Not to the holiday or the market, but to the sacrifice. They counted not because they were ordered to, but because it gave them a sense of time. Time without structure was frightening. Structured time was reassuring, even if it led to knives and blood. Philomela was the first to notice this. Previously, the days differed only in terms of weather. Now they had weight. One day was clean. Another was dangerous. The third was silent. People began to say not tomorrow or in 3 days, but after the sacrifice or before the cleansing. Thus, fear ceases to be a feeling. It becomes a calendar. On such days, it was forbidden to quarrel. Not because quarreling is evil, but because a sharp voice could disturb the balance. You couldn't go out to sea. You couldn't work with metal. Some said that the gods didn't like the sound of striking. In fact, people didn't like the sound that reminded them of a force beyond the control of ritual. Philomela learned to live within these limits. She learned to wake up with the feeling that today it was possible, but tomorrow it was not. It was surprisingly easy. The human soul quickly gets used to prohibitions if they are backed by fear. But over time, something else appeared. Silence. Not the kind of silence when there is nothing to say. The kind that appears when it is dangerous to speak. Euterpe once said to Philomela, "There are things that should not be asked aloud. Because if they receive an answer, it will break the ritual." "What answer?" asked Philomela. The old woman looked at her for a long time, as if deciding whether she was ready to hear it. That the gods may be silent, she said. And we will continue anyway. It was a dangerous thought. Because if the gods are silent and the ritual continues, it means that the ritual exists not only for them. Thus, in the Greek world, something appeared that could not be named, but could be felt, mystery. Not a riddle. Not a deception. A mystery as a form of protection. The first mysteries had no names. They took place at night, away from the eyes of those who were not yet ready. People were not invited, they were chosen. And this choice was already a sign, not everyone should know. Philomela was not invited right away. She was not a priestess. She was not pure in the sense that was beginning to take shape. But she saw how those who returned from such nights changed. They did not become happier. They became calmer. And calm in a world of fear is power. Once she saw a young woman who had lost 2 children return from the mystery and not cry for the first time in a long time. She was silent, but her silence was dense, as if she were holding something inside. People looked at her with respect and fear. Because those who know something that others do not know are always dangerous. Euterpe explained it simply. They don't show fear. They know where it's going. Where? Asked Philomela. At the right time. They didn't tell stories in the mysteries. They didn't teach there. They experienced there. People were led through the darkness. Through narrow passages. Through silence, where every sound seemed like the footsteps of a god. They were not told what would happen. Because knowledge in advance destroys fear. And fear was necessary. It was here that religion took another step. It ceased to be communal. It became a hierarchy of experience. Some knew more. Some knew less. Some were not to know at all. And this division was accepted without resistance. Because a person who is afraid is ready to give up the right to know to someone who seems calmer. Philomela understood this when the priest came to her. Not the old one, but the younger one, the one who now recorded the days and counted the sacrifices. You must come, he said. Not as an invitation. As a statement of fact. She did not ask where. She knew. The mystery took place at night. She was led away blindfolded. It was not for theatrical effect. It was so that she would stop trusting her eyesight. Because those who see want to control. In the darkness, she heard footsteps. Breathing. Someone nearby was crying quietly. Not from pain. From tension. When the blindfold was removed, the light was dim. There was a stone in front of her. On the stone was a grain of wheat. Next to it was a vessel of water. No one explained anything. She was told to touch the grain, then the water. Then darkness again. Then a voice that said only one thing. Remember. She didn't know what exactly. And that was the point. When she came out, the night was coming to an end. She felt tired, but not devastated. Her fear had not disappeared. It had settled. It had become deeper, calmer, more controlled. She understood, now she was not just part of the ritual. She was its bearer. And at this moment, part 1 comes to an end. Because where there is a bearer, there is always a rule. That cannot be broken without punishment. In the next part, the story will take a sharp turn. Fear will become a duty. The ritual will become law. And those who remain silent will begin to rule over those who still speak. No one in the village remembered when the ritual became an obligation. Because such things are not born out of command. They are born out of relief. At first, it was just a feeling that after the sacrifice, it was a little easier to breathe. Not because God had answered. But because people had done everything they could. Then they began to cherish that feeling. When something broke again, a poor harvest, illness, the death of a child, the first question was no longer why. The first question became something else. Was everything done correctly? Philomela heard it again and again. She heard people looking for mistakes not in the world, but in the procedure. Not in the gods, in the execution. And that was a turning point. Because when a person believes that a tragedy happened because of an incorrect ritual, they stop hating the world. And start checking themselves. That's how fear changes direction. It no longer looks outward. It looks inward, toward the community. Someone was late for the sacrifice. Someone spoke on a forbidden day. Someone did not purify themselves before the holiday. And each such case was now not a trifle, but a risk for everyone. People did not shout. They did not punish immediately. They watched. Because the worst thing that can happen in a society of fear is suspicion. Philomela felt it herself. Not because she had broken any rules. But because she had become part of a secret. After the mystery, people treated her differently. Not with respect. And not with fear. With caution. People watched her silence. How long she remained silent. And when she was silent. Because silence now meant not ignorance, but access. Once, a woman with a child in her arms approached her. The child was hot, his eyes cloudy. The mother did not cry. She had already gone through that stage. You know, she said. She did not ask. Philomela wanted to tell the truth, I don't know anything. But the words wouldn't come out. Because the truth in this world was no longer just a fact. It was a function. I know when to be silent, Philomela said instead. The mother nodded. That was the answer. That night, the child died. And no one said it was the mother's fault. No one said it was the will of the gods. They said something else. So it was meant to be. That phrase was more dangerous than any curse. Because it closed all questions. When it was necessary, there is no longer any coincidence. And there is no guilt that can be challenged. In Delphi, they understood this long ago. That is why their words were vague. Not to deceive. But to survive. A clear prophecy is easy to destroy. An ambiguous one lives for centuries. Gradually, rituals in the village ceased to be a response to tragedy. They became prevention. Now sacrifices were made not after disaster, but to prevent it from coming. Fear preceded the event. And in this was strength. When a person is afraid in advance, they obey more easily. Sacrifices were no longer random. They were chosen. Not the largest. Not the most valuable. But those that had the right symbolism. Young animals, because death must be pure. The first harvest grain, because the future must be given in advance. Wine, because joy also needs to be controlled. Blood became not the main element, but a seal. Without it, the ritual was considered incomplete. Philomela saw how people looked at the knife. Not with horror. With respect. Because the knife was no longer an instrument of death. It was an instrument of order. And the more often the ritual was repeated, the less cruel it seemed. Cruelty requires emotion. Order requires only execution. This is where religion crossed the line. It ceased to be a response to fear. And became a mechanism for controlling it. The priests no longer waited for signs. They made schedules. They determined when fear should appear. When it should be suppressed. When it should remind itself with blood. Philomela sometimes caught herself thinking that the world had become more understandable. More dangerous, yes. But more understandable. She knew what tomorrow would bring. She knew what was forbidden. She knew when to remain silent. And there was something reassuring about this knowledge. Just as there is peace in a cage for those who fear the open field. Once, a man from another town appeared in the village. He was talkative. He laughed too loudly. He did not take off his shoes where it was customary to do so. He did not know the rules, and he was not afraid. It was noticeable right away. He doesn't respect the gods, someone said. He just doesn't know, replied another. But there was no difference. Because ignorance in a system of fear is a threat. When the man fell ill a few days later, no one was surprised. When he died, it was taken as confirmation. No one said it could have been an accident. Because an accident would open the door to chaos again. Philomela watched this and felt something inside her tighten. Not doubt. Not protest. Responsibility. Because now she knew, the ritual works not because the god exists. It works because people believe in the consequences of breaking it. And as long as they believe, order is maintained. But every order has a price. And the longer it exists, the more it requires sacrifices, not symbolic ones, but human ones. Not always on a stone. Sometimes in the form of exile. Sometimes in the form of silence. Sometimes in the form of death without explanation. Philomela did not yet know that very soon the ritual would require her to make a choice. Not between faith and unbelief. But between order and humanity. And this choice always breaks those who understand the system too well. Philomela realized that the boundary had shifted on the day when the ritual was no longer a response to an event, but became the cause of action. It happened quietly. Without shouting. Without a prophetic sign. Without a storm. Just one morning, the priest announced that this time the sacrifice would be different. No one asked why. The question of why had long since become superfluous. Now they only asked how. And in that how lay all the power. They gathered as usual. The stone, the altar, the familiar movements. People stood a little closer to each other than before. Fear has a strange property over time, it does not separate, it compresses. It compresses until everyone can feel each other's breath. The priest spoke calmly. Too calmly. We have seen the signs, he said. And the signs say that the balance is unstable again. Someone swallowed. Someone bowed their head. We have sacrificed enough, the priest continued. But not from the right side. These words hung in the air. They explained nothing, but that was not necessary. Everyone understood what the right side meant. It meant a person. Not immediately. Not directly. But through logic that seemed flawless. First, expulsion. Then, silent removal. And only as a last resort, death. Because a society of fear always tries to appear merciful. The first was the same man from another polis who had died a few weeks ago. His name was no longer mentioned. His story was rewritten to serve as an example. Now they said that he brought unrest with him. That his laughter was too loud. That he did not respect boundaries. Philomela listened to this and felt something break inside her, not out of protest, but out of understanding. Because it was logical. Logic here was more dangerous than any madness. If a person doesn't fit in, they become a threat. If the threat disappears, order is restored. And if order is restored, then the decision was correct. This chain had no weak links. And that's why it was deadly. After that sacrifice, not yet blood, but already human, the village calmed down. Not immediately. But noticeably. People began to sleep a little longer. Children laughed again in the streets, though not as loudly. The sea was calm for several days. And that was enough. No one asked if it was really connected. Because the question could destroy what was finally working. Philomela noticed another change. Now the priest spoke not only about the gods, but also about duty to the community. They said that the ritual was not just a path to mercy, but a proof of loyalty. Those who did not attend not only risked incurring the wrath of the gods, but also endangered everyone else. Thus, faith ceased to be a personal matter. It became a civic act. And anyone who doubted it became not just an unbeliever. They became an enemy of the order. One evening, Euterpe came to Philomela without warning. She was more tired than usual. Her hands trembled as she touched the bowl of water. "Can you feel it?" she asked. "What?" Philomela replied quietly. "When the ritual begins to take on a life of its own." Philomela was silent. "We used to do this because we feared the gods," said Euterpe. "Now we fear each other." It was not said as a complaint. It was a statement of fact. "Is that wrong?" asked Philomela. Euterpe looked at her for a long time. "It's inevitable," she said. "When fear ceases to be wild, it is tamed. And tamed fear always needs care. And who cares for it? Those who know the rules." Philomela realized that now she was one of them. Not because she wanted to be, but because she saw the mechanism. And those who see the mechanism can no longer pretend that it is the will of the gods. Soon, something happened that changed her forever. People gathered in the square earlier than usual. There was no celebration. No sacrifice was announced. Just an order to be present. Such orders were not discussed. A young man stood before the altar. Not a stranger. Not an intruder from the past. One of their own. One who was born here. One who made sacrifices. One who remained silent on the right days. "He said he doesn't believe," said the priest. These words fell heavier than a stone. "He said that the gods do not speak," continued the priest. "That we only hear ourselves." The young man did not argue. He did not even look frightened. "I did not mean any harm," he said. "I just said that I cannot hear." It was worse than contempt. It was doubt. And doubt in such a system is a crack through which chaos returns. Philomela looked at the young man and knew, now something would happen that would make religion final. Not because of blood. Because of precedent. The priest did not raise his knife. He raised his hand. "Godlessness is not the absence of faith," he said. "It is a threat to order." And that was enough. The young man was led away. Not to his death. Not today. He was sent away. Beyond the borders. To a world without ritual. To a world without a calendar. It was worse than execution. Because exile is a return to chaos. When the people dispersed, Philomela stood there for a long time. She felt something inside her finally freeze. She understood, religion no longer serves fear. Fear now serves religion. And it is from this moment that the final stage begins. The one where doubt becomes a crime. Where silence is proof of loyalty. Where the system begins to defend itself even from the truth. Fear does not disappear suddenly. It wears itself out. Just as the body gets used to pain, people get used to ritual. Blood ceases to shock. Silence ceases to frighten. Prohibitions cease to surprise. And then the most dangerous thing happens. The world remains just as cruel. But fear no longer explains it. Philomela noticed this not in words, but in eyes. People still came. They still bowed their heads. They still obeyed. But they looked different. Not in anticipation. Not in horror. But with fatigue. Tired fear is the end of any system. Because when a person is afraid, they obey. When they get tired of being afraid, they start to think. It wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't anger. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible deviation. Someone was late once, and the world did not fall. Someone did not bring a gift, and nothing happened. Someone missed a day of silence, and the sea remained calm. These little things were more dangerous than open rebellion. Because they did not break the order. They questioned its necessity. Philomela saw how the young people listened to the priest's words, but did not catch every syllable. They did not look at the altar, but at each other. As if they were looking for confirmation not in the gods, but in the people around them. One evening, a boy, not the one who had been expelled, approached her. "You were there," he said. "At the mysteries." It was not a question. "I was," she replied. "And what did you see there?" Philomela was silent for a long time. "I saw fear," she said at last. "Formalized. Repetitive. Controlled." The boy nodded. "And God?" She didn't answer right away. "I saw a shadow," she said. "And people who decided that this shadow had a voice." Those words could have killed her a few years ago. Now they just hung in the air. And that was scary. Because it meant that fear was losing its monopoly. In the cities, people were already talking differently. People were appearing who did not whisper the names of gods, but uttered the words, nature, order, reason. They did not deny the gods. They simply did not consider them necessary to explain everything. They were called strange. Dangerous. Godless. But they did not destroy temples. They did not challenge rituals. They simply asked questions that could not be answered with sacrifice. Why do the good die before the wicked? Why does the storm strike the righteous and spare the wicked? Why are the gods silent when everything is done right? These questions did not sound like accusations. They sounded like curiosity. And curiosity is something no system of fear can withstand. The priests sensed this quickly. And they responded in the only way they knew how. They intensified the ritual. More prohibitions. More rules. More silence. But fear that must be constantly reinforced is no longer fear. It is habit. And habit does not stop thought. Philomela realized that her role was changing. She was no longer the bearer of a secret. The secret had become empty. It was just a shell, supported by movements and words. One day, she came to the spring again with Euterpe. "They no longer hear," said the old woman. "Neither the gods nor us." "Perhaps," replied Philomela, "they simply hear something else." Euterpe stared at the water for a long time. "When fear ceases to work," she said, "a choice comes." "What choice?" "Either we admit that the order was created by us. Or we make people fear even more." That was the final turning point. Because enforced fear is no longer religion. It is power. And power born of fear cannot afford to doubt itself. The accusations began. Not loud ones. Cautious ones. Under the guise of concern. Someone had gone cold. Someone asks too many questions. Someone confuses young people. Philomela knew that her name was also being mentioned. She saw it in their eyes. In the silence after her words. And in that silence, for the first time in a long time, she felt no fear. She felt clarity. Not the kind of clarity that calms. But the kind that compels action. One morning, she did not come to the ritual. Not in protest. Not as a challenge. She simply did not come. The world did not fall. The sea did not rise. The children did not die. And that was the most frightening sign of all. Because it meant that the gods, if they existed, no longer needed intermediaries. Philomela left the village before sunrise. Not into exile. By her own choice. She walked toward the city, where people talked, argued, and searched for reasons. She was going where fear was no longer the only language. She knew that rituals would live on for a long time. That priests would still have power. That blood would still be shed. But she also knew something else. A system that fears thought has already lost. Not today. Not tomorrow. But inevitably. Because fear can keep a person submissive. But it can never keep them that way forever. Epilogue. People still make sacrifices. Sometimes animals. Sometimes time. Sometimes truth. We no longer call it worshipping the gods. We call it tradition. Safety. Order. But the question remains the same as it was then, by the sea. Do we worship out of fear? Or out of habit? And the answer, as before, does not depend on the gods. It depends on whether we dare to ask the question and endure the silence that follows.